When Call of Duty World at War initially released, and that, I'll be honest with you, I was probably one of many that did not give it the initial respect that it deserved. For me personally, I was able to better identify with the last release, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, just because it touched on some topics that were currently going on within the world, and that with the global war on terror. However, many years later in that, as I've matured in that and come back to World at War numerous times, I've always been blown away with just how good of a game, or yeah, with how good of a campaign this game had. And a lot of that is because it does not shy away from just how violent and brutal warfare can actually be, especially that of the Second World War. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is just how some of the violence in this game, how some of the brutality in that really helped convey the story. So a lot of other times there are games that will incorporate violence or gore, all that other fun stuff in that, purely just for shock factor. In this game, is it shocking? Absolutely. However, it's done very, very tastefully, because it's not meant there to just sit there and make you feel disgusted or anything like that, but it's there to show you the harsh reality of what combat was like, especially in World War II. So one thing I want to throw out here real quick is World at War was very much based off of the Call of Duty 4 engine. However, despite being built off of the same engine, there were some gameplay things that Treyarch did actually change in that to, again, make the game feel a lot more violent and have much more of an impact for you as the player. So to start off, probably one of the most notable things is, depending on the weapon that you were using in that, unlike in previous Call of Duties, in World at War, you were able to take limbs off in that. So whether you were using something like a light machine gun or a heavy sniper rifle or even just a simple shotgun in that, it was not uncommon to see the enemies respond to taking a shot in that by losing a limb. On top of this and that, a lot of times enemies would not immediately die from those wounds. There were times that where, hey, you might shoot maybe a German or something like that in the legs. You would see their legs get blown off. However, they would still be sitting there looking at you, the player, as if, they were actually in pain. And it wasn't even just with the firearms in this game. It was also with some of the explosives as well. Chuck a grenade in most other Call of Duty games, and yes, you'll see an explosion. You'll see bodies potentially get ragdolled. However, in here, you might see some of their limbs come off. And again, this was kind of out of the blue in that for the Call of Duty series. A lot of times, COD was something that was a lot more action-packed. Yes, there were sometimes some heavy moments within the series and that, but they were kind of few and far between and meant more to be like plot devices, mostly to give you some sort of background on some sort of antagonist, or kind of give you, the player, some motivation to defeat said antagonist. However, within World at War, a lot of those more intense moments, they're a lot more common, and it's actually kind of the Michael Bay stuff that feels like that's going to be your break. So again, not only with just the weapons that you use on screen, but even with the melee system in that. This game was the first one to introduce the bayonet attachment to some of the standard bolt action rifles within the game. And again, when you went to melee with that, those melees felt a lot more impactful. It wasn't just like you see on the screen here, you swing your knife, character in front of you, they're done. That's it. They died. And you don't really know how. A lot of times when you went to melee somebody with the bayonet and that, it felt personal. It felt that you were striking at their heart, and you were trying to put that as far into their heart as you could. Not only that, but this game also introduced the Molotov grenade, especially you see that more in the Soviet campaign. And unlike other COD games that around this time and that, when you hit somebody with a Molotov, or if you were playing in the US campaign and you were using the M2 flamethrower in that, when you hit enemies with the fire, they didn't just die, but they would actually respond to the idea of they were being lit on fire. They would scream. You could definitely get the sense that the AI that you had currently engulfed in hell itself and that they were not feeling well. And I think it's because of the fact that you see those moments so much throughout the campaign. It really does a good job of conveying that, warfare is a pretty evil thing in that. Even if you're going into combat for all the right reasons, like I believe we can all agree that World War II was a very just war. There was a valid reason for stopping Nazi Germany or stopping, Imperial Japan and that. That doesn't change, though, just how brutal combat is. You can go into it with the best of reasons. It's still going to be living hell. Now, looking at the campaign in that, first we're going to talk about the U.S. Pacific campaign against Imperial Japan, just because, I'll be honest with you, I want to say out of the entire campaign, that being the U.S. side and the Soviet side, I do feel that the U.S. side is weaker. Not that it's bad, but I think that, again, the Soviet side just happens to capture a lot of the violence in that this game really, really excels in. But when we first start the game, our first mission, you are playing as Private Miller, who is a Marine Corps raider, and you are currently captured by some Imperial Japanese soldiers on an island. And as soon as the game starts in that, one of the first things that you see is those Imperial Japanese soldiers, they're kind of taking their time in that just to go through and execute you. You see one of your comrades have a cigarette shoved into his face, and then immediately afterwards he's spit on and his throat is slit. Which, to be honest, was something that you could open up a history book and read quite a bit about. Unfortunately, it is the reality that Japan at this time, they were a very brutal nation. Weirdly enough, one of the reasons why they were so brutal was they spread a lot of misinformation against some of their lower enlisted troops that, hey, if you were ever captured by the Americans or any sort of other allied forces, they would just do absolutely abysmal things to you. And this kind of but it allowed the Japanese in that to be a lot more violent towards their enemies, because they figured, hey, if the roles were reversed in this situation, they'd be doing it to me. Now, was it true? Absolutely not. And that, again, not saying that any country was without fault during the war in that. However, just the level of brutality that we saw from Imperial Japan was conveyed rather well in this game. On top of that, we do also get to see a fair bit of bonsai charges where, Japanese soldiers were known to rush U.S. forces, essentially with no regard to their own lives. You could actually research a lot of stuff about like the human wave tactics that they would employ, where there would just be waves upon waves of Japanese soldiers rushing positions, essentially kind of to the point where, hey, if they can't shoot all of us, eventually somebody will be alive in that to actually defeat them. And there are plenty of moments like that in here, of course, due to limitations in that with the technology at the time, we don't get the full effect from it that you would actually get if you were a veteran of that specific campaign. But I think it is interesting, though, that they brought it over. One of the other things that you often see a lot of times, too, is that when you do engage the forces of Imperial Japan in that, they will try to not only close the gap on you for melee combat with their bayonets, but should you wound them in that, they will not try to surrender. They will either immediately go towards trying to grab their sidearm and attacking you with that, or just flat out activating a grenade while they're essentially on their deathbed. That is something that, again, throughout World War II and that, we did see quite a bit. I can't remember the specific battle that had occurred. However, whenever U.S. forces had taken one of the islands, there was actually video footage of Japanese civilians jumping off cliffs to their death in that, just because they were so afraid of the American forces that were coming. The other thing, too, is at that time, it was kind of, Japanese belief that death in battle was infinitely more honorable than being captured or surrendering, anything like that. So a lot of times these troops, they would fight to the death. And you do see a good bit of that throughout the American Pacific campaign. Now, to turn our attention more over towards the Soviet style, let me just say in that I am well aware that a lot of times us here in the States or other allied countries in that, we do tend to paint the Soviet Red Army a little bit different than what we do our own countries in that. I think the main reason is so for starters, again, despite, the fact that, yes, were there some bad actors on the Allied forces and that during World War II? Absolutely. Are there some things that we still debate today that whether or not they should have done? Again, 100%. However, we are able to kind of separate the fact that, hey, these men, they did defeat some of the more evil empires in the world at that time and probably throughout human history. And we do kind of tend to focus more on their heroics or their stoicism and that is how we choose to portray them, with some sort of reverence for the deeds that they were able to accomplish. I don't disagree with this because, like I said, yes, there may have been bad actors in that on all sides during the war. However, I think the benefits that, the Allied forces were able to achieve infinitely outweigh any sort of evil that they might have done. Again, it doesn't excuse it, but I think we just also have to understand things that were going on at around that time. However, though, because of everything that went on with the Soviet Union following World War II and that, we oftentimes don't kind of give the Soviets that same level of, I guess you could kind of call it respect in that, but we're not afraid to show them as more bloodthirsty when it comes to combat. And that's demonstrated very well in this particular game. And I know some people may say that that's insensitive towards the Russians because they did put forth a great bit of effort in that to help the Allied forces defeat Nazi Germany. But I would say, though, it is actually a little bit more realistic in that because a lot of times, hey, your average soldier that's fighting, war is a very traumatic thing. And sometimes, people can be very easily pushed to enact the same violence that they see the enemy do onto them. So in the Soviet campaign, the game starts with the mission Vendetta, where essentially you're playing as Private Dmitry Petrenko, the legend himself, who would actually also make an appearance in the original Black Ops in that. But you're fighting from a fountain. And what you can kind of surmise based on everything that's going on is this fountain was some sort of last stand with whether that be your squad or just other fire teams, something like that. But regardless, everybody there has pretty much either been killed or is on the brink of death. The mission starts with, you kind of wake up in that. You're seeing birds feast on the dead corpses around you. There's instantly a Nazi soldier that kind of arrives to the fountain. He's just looking around to see anybody that might still be alive and just without hesitation executes them right there on the spot. Of course, after this we link up with another legendary character, Reznov himself, and we begin a sniping campaign to essentially avenge our fallen comrades. One of the things that typically you would see in a lot of other Call of Duty games is, anytime there would be some sort of like sniper mission or section in that, what you do during that mission oftentimes kind of changes the course of that particular battle. Your side is going to be saved and the entire tide of the battle is going to turn. However, I think Vendetta does a really good job of, even if you have one soldier who's incredibly talented at their craft in that, sometimes that may not be enough in that to turn the tide of the battle. There were several moments during that particular mission in that where you're putting in work, you're working your way up to assassinate General Amsel. But as you look out into the battlefield in that, there might be a moment where you see, your fellow Soviet soldiers in that charging towards the next Nazi held area, just to see an MG42 open up and eviscerate all of them right in front of you. And there's nothing that you can do because ultimately your job at the end of that mission is, hey, you are tasked to assassinate this German general. As much as it might suck to watch all of your fellow countrymen die, just kind of got to bottle that shit up and keep on moving through. After that mission, you do assassinate the general. And then, of course, who would have thunk, the Nazis figure out where you fired from. They send all their forces after you. Understandably, I think any army that you would assassinate a general, they would want to take that target out as quickly as they could. And in the next mission, you wake up in that, and again, you are kidnapped, or not kidnapped, but you are being held prisoner by the Nazis. And I think it's very fair to say that, they don't have the best attitude towards you, and there's a fair chance that, if Reznov didn't knock down the door in the next 30 seconds and that, you might die, or at bare minimum, be tortured to the point where you might hope for death. But all that being said, once that section ends, it's actually very interesting because I think one of the other things that the Soviet side does is you have Reznov, who is very, very bloodthirsty in that, towards the Nazis. However, you also have Private Chernov in that, who, yes, he is a soldier, but he also doesn't want to surrender his humanity in that, He can acknowledge that, yes, there is evil going on during the war. However, he himself wants to remain as honorable as possible. He doesn't get thrills out of murdering, an enemy that's already dead. And that's actually one of the first things that you're put up to in that mission where you're kind of pushing through Silo Heights. Essentially, the soldiers that had captured you in that, they're kind of on the ground bleeding out. Reznov, he hands you a Mosin Nagant. Again, just so happens to have a bayonet on it. And he's like, hey, these guys here, how about you help them bleed out, my friend? Chernov is very quick to say, like, hey, these guys are already injured. Like, they're probably going to just bleed out and die anyways. Why do we have to actually go through and essentially murder them? One of the interesting things is, for me, that I kind of found myself doing is, a lot of times I kind of treated the AI in that as if, I don't want to say if it was another real human being, but I would immediately bayonet them. In my opinion, it's like, hey, I knew that if this roles were reversed in that, again, they'd be doing the exact same thing to me. So yes, even though this is a video game, why should I show them mercy? Especially with all the connotations that we have towards Nazi Germany. A lot of times in my head, it was like, if anybody deserves to have a bayonet run through them, it might be these guys here. That I don't see anything wrong with it. And I think the way that, this game does tie in real history in some of its cutscenes, it does very much kind of help push the player in that to feel like, hey, because these guys were so evil, it's okay to do some of these horrible things. As the Soviet campaign progresses in that, of course, we do make the push into Berlin in that, and there are plenty of moments in that where we get to see Russian soldiers in that. They've taken Nazi prisoners, and instead of, trying to take them as POWs, like fully like move them out to any sort of camp or anything like that, they just kind of look at it as like, why waste the resources when we've got all this ammo? Let's murder them right here, because that's what they've been doing to us all this time. And you kind of get it, right? Because when you look at the Battle of Stalingrad and some of the atrocities that were committed there by the Germans, to put myself in, your standard Russian soldier's shoes, I think I too would be out for blood. If it was me for months on end that was seeing, my family and my loved ones butchered and just abused in that, and now I have a chance to enact revenge on the enemy and make them feel the same way I had felt, I'd be lying if I said that there wasn't like some sort of primal part of me that was like, I'm gonna make these fuckers hurt just like I've been hurt. And again, I feel like that's where the Soviet campaign just really, really excels, because we are fighting these Nazi troops in that. And again, for a lot of us, we learned about the atrocities that the Nazis had committed during World War II. And when, you know, us as a player, we're kind of seeing some of that stuff, of course, only in a video game setting, enacted out right in front of us, we do kind of feel that regardless of what we do, it doesn't even remotely compare to any of the evil that they've done. There's actually a really, really good scene in one of the missions. I can't recall offhand what it is, but essentially it's right before you kind of board like an underground metro station and that. And essentially you have like a fire team of Nazi soldiers and that. They're looking to surrender. And you're kind of left with one option. I'm sorry, you're left with two choices. And that is, do you do what is maybe, I guess, and weirdly enough in this situation, the morally right thing, where you spray them down with lead, give them a quick and, you know, not as painful death? Or do you join in with your comrades and throw Molotovs on them just so that they can burn and suffer? Now, what's interesting is if you do choose to shoot them, again, Reznov will kind of give you like an audio cue saying like, you know, hey, this was, you know, yes, you did kind of, I don't want to say murder them in cold blood, but, you know, maybe you shouldn't have stolen this opportunity and that from your comrades, because they, rightfully so, kind of have it out for these guys. If you do choose to, you know, light them on fire with a Molotov and join in with the rest of your comrades in that, you know, Reznov will make another statement saying like, huh, maybe you should have just gunned them right down and saved them this really painful death. Following that, the mission that you actually saw on screen prior to this one of the first things that you immediately see is, so at that point in the campaign, you've pretty much pushed into Berlin. And one thing just to keep in mind is at this point in the war, Nazi Germany was kind of using anybody that they could in that to fight. A lot of times it was the old, it was the sick. You know, if you were a male and you could hold a weapon in that, you were probably going to take part in the conflict that was coming to some extent. And we see some hung Nazi soldiers in that. And for those of you that can speak German or read it, beneath their bodies is something that essentially calls them cowards or traitors. I forget what exactly the translation is, but again, this is stuff that legitimately happened throughout World War II. Especially during the Battle of Berlin. Again, a lot of people, they kind of knew what was coming. They had heard the stories in that of the Red Army, and they were rightfully afraid of, like, you know, hey, if these people get here, they're going to kill us. Like, there is no incentive for them to take prisoners or anything like that. They're just going to run amok. And again, to kind of put yourself in, you know, potentially somebody who's been conscripted into the Nazi army and that, especially that of maybe someone who's older or even younger, especially younger in that, you know, you're being thrust into a conflict that you really have no idea what's all going on. And the only thing that you're told is like, hey, if you do not go out here and fight your damnedest in that, not only are these people going to kill you, but they're going to kill your family. They're going to kill everyone that you love. They're going to absolutely just destroy, you know, our country. I could kind of understand somebody wanting to get the hell out of Dodge before things got bad. And, of course, you know, your final fight, so with the current mission that we're doing here, fighting through the Reichstag and that, where that very famous photo of the Soviets posting the flag over the building occurs in that, you do get a sense of pride over that. And I do think it's interesting, right? Because even over these last couple of missions and that, you know, we are still seeing that very, very brutal combat. But when you get to it, you still kind of get that feeling that you've triumphed over an enemy. But, yeah, to me, that's just kind of one of the big things in that I've noticed about this game and that I really appreciate about it. You know, I'll be honest with you, when this game first dropped, I really didn't pay much attention to it, other than, of course, the fact that it had Nazi zombies. I did play a fair bit of the multiplayer in that. Actually, weirdly enough, I got to ninth prestige in here. It sounds like I'm talking shit on the game, but or it sounds like I'm talking that I thought the game was shitty when it first came out, but I was always kind of more drawn, you know, to the more modern setting of COD 4 in that, just because, again, I could kind of better relate to it. The global war on terror was a very real thing that was going on. Also, as somebody who was interested and ended up joining the military myself in that, I was always kind of more captivated by COD 4. But as I've gotten older, especially even after joining the military and playing through this game, one of the things that I have always appreciated is it doesn't shy away from, you know, just how brutal conflict can be. And I think that's absolutely huge, you know. Yes, this game, it is fun, you know, it meets everything that you would want out of a COD game. But it also just has this, like, kind of very dark and brooding atmosphere to it. The combat for a video game does feel intense, especially, you know, at that point in time. I think we also have to remember the time frame of which this game came out. But yeah, I love this game. I think it's absolutely phenomenal in that. I think the campaign just did such a wonderful job of showing, you know, some of the brutality that occurred during the Second World War. And again, regardless of, you know, maybe how brutal things were, did we still defeat, you know, a much bigger evil by maybe doing some smaller evil things ourselves? 100%, but I think it's just so interesting in that how this game was able to kind of use violence as a way to further its storytelling in that throughout the campaign. But that's all from me. Let me know your thoughts about it. Are there any games out there where when you play through them, do they kind of set a certain tone that you just really, really enjoy in that? Again, for me, this has always been one of them. But yeah, feel free to let me know down in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching, and catch you next time.